Thank you everyone for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce today Katya Jay. She is a postdoctoral associated in the Environment Data Science Innovation Inclusion Lab at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her work focuses on global change effects on terrestrial ecosystems and bridging field ecology with computational approaches. Currently, she's investigating the role of abiotic heterogeneity, plant traits, and wood expansion in shaping alpine tundra ecosystem functions and exposure to climate change. She received her bachelor's in biology from McMaster College and her PhD in integrative biology from Oregon State University. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours, Katya.
Thanks, Sibeli, for that introduction, and thanks everyone for coming to my talk. I'm excited to be sharing with you today some of my previous postdoc research. So I did a postdoc here at CU and InStar from working with the Niwot Ridge LT before I started at ESOL. That's what a lot of this talk will be focusing on. Sorry, still recovering from a cold. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit at the end about the work that I'll be doing here at ESOL and that I'm currently doing. And I'm also currently being supported half-time through NEON, so I'll be talking briefly about what I'm doing with them as well. I just wanted to start just with a really quick background, kind of give you an idea of where I'm coming from. So my training before my postdoc was primarily as a field ecologist. My PhD work was in coastal dune ecosystems, where I focused on investigating the role of dune grasses kind of as ecosystem engineers through biophysical feedbacks. They shape the coastal ecosystem functioning. So I spent a lot of time out in the field. You can see just measuring or surveying vegetation and measuring topography of each dune. But in my postdoc, I was interested in kind of being able to merge this field background with more computational and modeling tools that can used to address questions about ecosystem processes and change. And I had the opportunity to come here to CU to work at Niwot Ridge and to work with people at NCAR as well to kind of try to merge some of that field background with modeling tools. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So just kind of to step back a little bit to give a little introduction to the tools that I'll be talking about. Earth system models represent complex processes and interactions between the land and the ocean and the atmosphere, and can allow us to make predictions about climate variability and change. So CESM is the Community Earth System Model, which is primarily developed by scientists at NCAR. And then today I'll be talking a lot about CLM, or the Community Land Model, which is the land component of that Earth System Model. And that can be a really useful tool for predicting ecosystem change and generating ecological hypotheses. And as you might imagine, these models are continuing to evolve in complexity and adding more features, and partially toward the goal of better predicting changes to ecosystems and to the biosphere. In particular, today I'll be talking about the hillslope hydrology configuration within CLM that I've been using to better represent alpine ecosystems. And then I'll also be talking a little bit about this ecosystem demography model that can represent vegetation in a more complex way than the default way that we do in CLM. And overall, hopefully I'll convince you that being able to connect ecosystem modeling and measurement efforts can be a really important way to better understand terrestrial ecosystems. So the community land model is a really complex process-based model. As I said, this kind of gives you an idea of an overview of some of the processes represented in this model. So things like the carbon cycle, surface energy fluxes, hydrological cycle. And while these models are typically run at global scales, they can also be run at point scales to ask more kind of ecosystem scale questions and to integrate site level information into the model. And that's what I'll be focusing on today. And generally, these models can simulate vegetation growth and carbon cycling through plant functional types, or PFTs, which you'll hear me talking a lot about today as well. But these are often unable to characterize the diverse growth strategies of vegetation. But basically, plant functional types are broad groupings of vegetation based on traits, and based on similar biomes, so things like Arctic sea grass or a tropical deciduous tree. And I'll be talking more about that later. And then also I mentioned there's this kind of new hillslope hydrology configuration that can be used within CLM. It was developed by Sean Swenson at NCAR, who's one of my co-authors on this work. And it can allow us to consider the effects of topography on water availability. And it considers the effects of aspect and elevation. And basically allows us to kind of incorporate hydrologic connectivity into our simulations. So we can have multiple columns in our model setup that are connected by this lateral flow of water. And it is really useful for thinking about graphically complex landscapes, such as alpine tundra, and just allows us to kind of incorporate that hill slope scale variability. And it also allows us to look at the effects of solar radiation on north and south facing aspects. And I'll be talking more about that part of this talk. So our study site is the Niwot Ridge Long-Term Ecological Research Site, which has a really long history of measurements going back to the 1980s. Things like plant community composition and snow depth, and there's also some kind of exciting newer data streams. For example, there are 2 flux towers up in the alpine tundra, so you can see what one of those looks like, and that's been running since 2008, and we can use that as kind of an input data stream for the model. And because this is a high alpine environment, there's a lot of micro scale variation across the landscape due to the effects of topography and wind, and how that wind is redistributed across the landscape, or sorry, the snow is redistributed across the landscape by wind. And then also data from the site. So here we have annual maximum temperatures on this plot going back to the 1950s, is showing this is at a subalpine and an alpine site. And you can see that there's a pretty strong warming trend here, and this is faster than the global average warming trend. So this is our kind of our study area that we were interested in trying to represent with the model. This area at Niwot Ridge we call the saddle, and it has, we can represent it with this 3-column configuration, kind of an idealized hill slope with the 2 east and west facing area, and then like a downslope area in between them that receives moisture subsidies from above. And this area has 3 distinct vegetation communities as a result of differences in exposure via wind and aspect and resulting snow accumulation. So you can see that really clearly in this photo here. So in the background, we have the green arrows pointing to what we call the moist meadow. So this photo was taken in late June, and it's still holding pretty significant snow. It accumulates more snow on that aspect because of wind. In contrast to the foreground, the orange arrow pointing to this really kind of dry, rocky area that we call the dry meadow. And because it's really windblown, it doesn't tend to hold much snow throughout the winter. It tends to have a really thin snowpack. And then the low-lying areas that tend to accumulate moisture from above and tend to have more productive vegetation is what we're calling the wet meadow here. And we tend to see differences in resource acquisition strategies among these communities due to differences in environmental conditions. So the wetter areas tend to have more resource acquisitive traits or growth strategies, in contrast to kind of more resource conservative strategies in the drier areas. And what I mean by that is just resource acquisitive tends to be plants that are growing faster, taller, have larger, thinner leaves, in contrast to slower growing, more stress tolerant plants with smaller, thicker leaves, generally in the conservative communities. Okay, so I'm gonna focus on 2 different projects that I worked on throughout my previous postdoc, kind of under this theme of using CLM with site observations to simulate alpine tundra. And I started by trying to parameterize the model at Niwot Ridge and then applying it to 2 different questions that we're interested in. So first, I'm going to start with the role of topography and aspect in shaping exposure to future warming. And just to kind of introduce this project, I wanted to acknowledge all of my awesome co-authors and collaborators who have contributed to this work, some of whom are here today. In particular, my postdoc mentors, Will Weeder and Katie Suding. And Will's a project scientist at NCAR and is also at CU. And Katie is a professor here at CU. And we recently published this work in JGR Biogeosciences if you're interested in learning more. So we kind of had 3 overall questions guiding this work. So 1, can we use CLM to reproduce patterns of snow, soils, and productivity across this topographically complex tundra site? So that's kind of parameterizing the model, seeing if it would work at the site, and then if so, we wanted to examine how aspect-driven differences in radiation might alter kind of patterns in ecosystem function and snow throughout this site. And then lastly, projecting out to 2100, we are curious in seeing how landscape position via aspect and vegetation community might moderate exposure to future climate change. So I'm going to start with kind of giving you an overview of our model workflow, and I'm going to come back to this figure a couple times throughout the talk. But we have a bunch of different data sources available at the site. And for site input data, we have, as I mentioned, those flux towers up in the alpine. So those, we can get meteorology data from those, so things like wind speed, humidity, air temperature. We also have precipitation data available from the saddle, and we pulled some radiation data from a nearby Ameriflux tower, so we can use all of that as site input data. And we have this kind of 3-column configuration to represent these 3 different communities. But in order to represent the vegetation that grows there, we needed to do some parameterization of the default PFT that's most similar to alpine vegetation is the Arctic C3 grass, but we needed to modify it to better represent those diverse alpine growth strategies that I mentioned. So we have a lot of different data sets available from the site, including things like foliar traits, phenology information that we can get from some phenocams up there. And then also there's a lot of parameters in the model relating to things like hydraulics and photosynthetic efficiency and things like that that we can modify to try to better represent alpine growth strategies. And we also have a lot of data sets available to us to evaluate our results. So as I mentioned before, this site has kind of a long history of measurements. So we have measurements of snow depth, and then more recently some soil temperature and moisture data from the site, as well as productivity data from various different sources. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. So before I get into thinking about aspect effects, I'm going to show you how we evaluated the model against observations. So in all these figures, the black lines represent observations and the colored lines represent the model results with 3 different communities in green, blue, and orange. And then on the top, we have snow depth, in the middle, soil temperature, and on the bottom, soil moisture. And these are all averaged by day of year over 12. So we ran the model from 2008 to 2021. So averaged over that whole period. So starting with snow, you can see that we have this gradient in snow accumulation across these 3 communities. As I mentioned before, the moist meadow has the deepest snowpack, and the dry meadow kind of has a very thin and variable snowpack throughout the winter. And although we're not matching the observations perfectly, we can see that the timing both of snowmelt and kind of the magnitude of the peak snow depth is matching the observations pretty well. And as a result of these differences in snow, we see kind of differences in soil temperature and moisture across these communities. So for example, in the dry meadow, soils are warmer throughout the growing season and colder in the winter, in comparison to the moist and wet meadow where soils are remaining close to freezing throughout the winter. So that's kind of that buffering effect of the snowpack. And then the soils are warming up later in the year as well. And then we also see differences in soil moisture. And you can see that we had some biases here. We had some trouble kind of capturing the patterns in soil moisture, especially throughout the growing season. Here in the dry meadow, it was challenging to kind of capture the peak of soil moisture and then the dry down throughout the growing season. But something you can't see here, we did capture the interannual variability really well. And these are averaged over the full study period, but I thought that was really cool. And although we have some biases, hopefully this is convincing you that the model is working pretty well at this site and we're able to capture the patterns we see in the observations pretty well. And as a result of these differences in snow and soil temperature and moisture, we see pretty strong gradient in productivity and growing season length across these communities. So on the top is the area index in the model, and the bottom is gross primary productivity, which is summed over, it's an annual sum for each community. So you can see the dry meadow has the longest growing season, but is the least productive. And it matches like what we see in the phenocam, where we tend to see kind of cooler, wetter communities in the moist meadow and warmer, drier communities in the dry meadow. And then comparing to observations here, in black, we have this This is from the flux tower. So we only have observations from the dry meadow since that's where the tower is located. But you can see that we're at least within the range of variability of the observations. Okay, so coming back to this kind of model workflow figure, now that we've evaluated our results against observations, we can do some model application. And as I said before, we were interested in kind of exploring the role of aspect in the alpine. So first we use the feature within the hill slope hydrology configuration to set up a north and south facing aspect with all 3 communities on each and with the same slope. And then we also projected out to 2100 under an SSP 370 scenario. And we did that for all 3 communities on north and south aspects, as well as the control, which is just the saddle site kind of configuration that I've been showing you. So starting with some of the aspect results, as you would expect, we saw decreased snowpack in south aspects across our site. So in these plots, we have snow depth on the top and runoff on the bottom, again, averaged by day of year from 2008 to 2021. And then the dashed lines are representing south aspects and the solid lines are north aspects. And although there was a significant decrease in kind of maximum snow depth, surprisingly, there wasn't a huge difference in kind of the snow melt out date on the south aspects. But as a result of differences in snow, we did also see changes in the timing of runoff, especially here in the wet meadow. You can see that it's peaking about 2 weeks earlier and just decreased runoff in general. And then now looking at soil temperature and moisture, again, as you would expect, south aspects were drier and warmer overall in terms of their soils. But there was some interesting seasonal variation across the communities that I wanted to highlight. So for example, in the dry meadow, you can see throughout the winter, there's kind of a bigger difference in soil temperature. So soils were a lot warmer on the south aspect, but that difference was smaller throughout much of the growing season. And in contrast, the moist meadow had very little difference in soil temperature throughout the winter, but a larger difference during the growing season. So it's kind of suggesting that the thicker snowpack in those areas is buffering the south aspect from experiencing that winter increase in soil temperature. So the differences in snow accumulation across the site might be moderating how these communities would experience warming across different aspects. So now I'm going to show you some results from those future projections out to 2100. So in these plots, the left panels are showing the south aspect, the right panels are showing the north aspect, and again, dashed in solid lines, and then the results from the future scenario experiment will be in black, and the colored results are the control. So comparing kind of the control period to the last 13 years of our future simulation to 2100. So overall, we can see that snow is melting out about 2 weeks earlier, and on the south aspect, kind of a decreased peak in snow depth as well. And as we saw before with north and south aspects, we see a shift in the timing of runoff, with the peak being significantly earlier. And this kind of shift in the timing of snowmelt and runoff would have significant implications for the vegetation. So this could result in kind of a decoupling of the timing of resource availability and plant demand throughout the growing season, especially as that runoff is occurring earlier. So this could lead to an increase in plant water stress or potential shifts in plant community composition. We were interested in seeing if the changes between the control and future scenarios were more moderated by plant community type or by aspect. So these figures are going to summarize the changes between control and future scenarios. So starting with change in mean annual soil temperature here, and again, the dashed boxes represent south aspects and the solid ones represent north aspects for each community. So here I'm showing you the change in surface soil temperature over that period from 2008 to 2100, averaged by community and aspect, and then the dashed line around 3.5 is the change in air temperature over that same time period. So you can see that the dry meadow, in particular, surface soils are really tracking that change in air temperature closely. In contrast, the more snow-covered areas remained somewhat buffered and increased much less in terms of their soil temperatures. So at least here, it seems like community type was fairly strong control on increases in soil temperature. And now looking at percent change in soil moisture during the growing season. These are normalized to the baseline soil moisture of each community. And here you can see kind of both community and aspect differences. In particular, the moist and dry meadow, the south aspect was consistently drier in terms of its growing season soils. And then the wet meadow actually showed very little difference in soil moisture, both in the future scenario as well as between aspects. So this kind of suggests that these moisture subsidies from upslope could help maintain similar conditions under a warming scenario in this area that tends to stay wetter throughout the growing season. And then lastly, looking at growing season length, we found that increases in growing season length were strongly moderated by aspect, especially the moist and wet meadow. There were pretty large increases in growing season length as a result of the large decline in snowmelt dates that I showed earlier. And since growing season length is a kind of key control on productivity, especially in these areas in the alpine that have really short growing seasons, this can have cascading impacts on vegetation. But overall, our results are showing kind of the buffering role of topography and microscale variation across alpine tundra, and suggesting that rates of change might vary across the landscape based on aspect as well as topography. So to summarize that, we found that we can use the community land model with hill slope hydrology to capture differences across a topographically complex landscape in soils and snow and productivity. And then also we found that altered timing of snowmelt and runoff might be decoupling resource availability from plant demand in the growing season. And generally, exposure to future climate warming is likely to be moderated by landscape position in these alpine ecosystems. Okay, so I'm going to transition a little bit to the second project that I worked on in my postdoc. And a lot of the kind of model setup is the same. So a lot of what I just showed you will feed right into this work, but kind of picking up after we were able to evaluate the model at our site, we then wanted to explore the role of plant trait uncertainty in shaping future tundra productivity under climate change. So we know that these alpine systems are really heterogeneous and rapidly changing. And as I mentioned before, they tend to have really diverse vegetation growth strategies that can vary quite a bit in terms of their functional traits and resource acquisition. Yeah, as I mentioned, the default PFTs within CLM are likely unable to capture all these diverse growth strategies. For example, in this illustration here, you can see a confusion plant, which is a common plant up in the alpine that tends to grow really slowly and live a really long time. And it's just not going to be well represented by the default Arctic sea grass. But these potential vegetation and trait responses to climate change, these vegetation responses to climate change are likely to include shifts in community level traits as a result of things like community turnover or adaptation. So we were kind of interested in exploring with this modeling approach, how important might these shifts in traits be, especially relative to the uncertainty in general in terms of future climate scenarios. So our two main goals were first to incorporate site level plant traits to improve model performance for this alpine ecosystem. So kind of seeing how much that can improve model performance, and then second, quantifying the magnitude of trait uncertainty relative to climate scenario uncertainty. So in order to do that, we modified sets of parameters in the model to represent either more resource acquisitive or conservative plant communities, and then projected those under two different SSP scenarios. And I'll talk more about what that looked like in a moment. So kind of coming back to this model workflow, as I mentioned, we had the same model set up here as what I described for the previous project. And this time I'm not going to go into much detail about model evaluation, but instead focus on these future experiments that we did. So we extended our simulations out to 2100 under a medium and a medium high emissions scenario. And then we also had different trait sensitivity experiments where plant communities were shifted to either represent more resource acquisitive or conservative communities. But before I get into that, I'm gonna kind of first show some of the site-specific changes that we've made to better represent the site. So as I said, we have a lot of foliar trait data available to us, and here I'm showing you specific leaf area, leaf C/N, and Delta 13C, which is you can think of as a kind of proxy for water use efficiency. And here we can see that these three communities are really different in terms of their traits. So we're seeing the wet meadow having high specific leaf area, so larger, thinner leaves in contrast to smaller, thicker leaves in the dry meadow. And then kind of the opposite for Delta 13C, so lower values in the wet meadow and higher values in the dry meadow, as you'd expect, with the dry meadow being kind of more water use efficient and more stress tolerant. So you can see here that these communities are really distinct in their traits and that these differences might be important to incorporate into the model. And we can also incorporate site-specific phenology information into our simulations. So since we're starting with the kind of default Arctic C3 graphs for all of these three communities, they would all have the same phenology and the same timing of green up, but we know that those things are likely different in these communities. And we can pull this greenness, green chromatic coordinate, which is a measure of greenness from these phenocam images, and create these GCC curves, and then extract these phenometrics from those GCC curves. So things like start of growing season, end of growing season, peak of growing season dates. And this analysis was done by my co-author, Sarah Elmendorf, who's here. And just to show you a couple results from that, we can see that phenology does vary between our communities. So the dry meadow is greening up earlier in the year, and it's also peaking earlier in the year in terms of peak greenness. And we were able to incorporate these differences into all of the model parameters that kind of control the timing of phenology and so, and I've shown you some of the tuning and parameterization that went into this. There's a lot more that I won't be able to cover, but I'm just gonna quickly kind of show you some model evaluation for GPP. So this plot is showing you gross primary productivity averaged over the 12 years. And in black, we have observations from that flux tower, and this is only for the dry meadow again. And then the dashed line represents a default CLM simulation without any of these trait modifications. The solid line represents the 9-watt specific simulation that I did with all the different traits and site-specific information that I incorporated. So you can see, obviously, we were biased really high in productivity before including all these site-specific information. And then we see the same pattern here with above ground NPP, or net primary productivity. So again, the dashed boxes represent the default simulations, and then the solid boxes, which are a little bit hard to see, they're overlapping with the observations in black, represent those with 9-watt specific traits. So you can see that incorporating these site-specific changes is really important to better represent our alpine vegetation. And here I'm comparing to above ground biomass harvest from our site. Okay, so now that I've shown you the models working at our site, I'm going to talk some about these experiments that we did to quantify plant trait and climate scenario uncertainty under climate change scenarios. So first, we had 3 different trait experiments. So one being the control, which is just the model parameterized for the site, as I've shown you. And then we changed 3 different traits together to represent more resource acquisitive or conservative communities. And those traits were SLA, leaf C/N, and Kmax, which is just a plant hydraulic conductance parameter in the model. And based on subordinations, we know that these traits tend to covary. So as SLA increases, leaf C/N decreases generally. So for more acquisitive communities, we increase SLAs, increase leaf C/N, and increase Kmax, and we did the opposite for a little bit more conservative growth strategies. And we did that for each of the 3 communities. And then we also had 2 different forcing pathways to 2100, so an SSP 245 and an SSP 370. So you can see in this figure, that's kind of the medium and medium high emissions scenarios. And as a result of that, we had 6 different experiments, and we wanted to partition the uncertainty among these different simulations. So thinking about the variability in future productivity, we wanted to partition that into trait experiment and climate forcing scenario contributions. So we used a fixed effect analysis of variance, kind of following the methods of Bonin et al. 2019 to partition that total uncertainty into the different components. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. So again, here I'm showing gross primary productivity averaged by day of year, and this is for the control or historical, so 2008 to 2021 for our 3 communities. And you can see the differences in growing season length and productivity consistent with observations and what I've been telling you about the site. And then adding on top of that, the future projections. So there's a lot going on here, but in red and blue is the 2 different SSP scenarios. And here we're just averaging again over the last 13 years of the simulation compared to the historical. And then the shading around each of those lines represents the variation due to traits. So with the dashed line on the bottom being the resource conservative scenarios and the dashed lines above being the resource acquisitive scenarios and the bold line in the middle being the control. So you can think of the shading around the line as the variability due to traits, and then the differences between the colors is the variability due to climate scenario. So you can see generally that it seems like the climate scenario is more controlling the timing of green up and phenology, especially in the moist and wet meadow. We see much earlier green up in that higher emissions scenario, as you'd expect with snow melting earlier and more warming. So plants are greening up much earlier, but it seems like kind of the peak productivity throughout the growing season is more being controlled by that variation due to traits, especially here in the dry meadow, where you can see there was actually very little difference between the 2 future scenarios. And then I'll show you what that looks like in that partitioning and variance analysis that I mentioned. So these plots are showing you the proportion of variance that can be attributed either to traits, so those are in green, blue, and orange, and then to forcing scenario in gray for each community. And we calculated this for each year, so you can see how it changes from our time series from 2008 to 2100. So generally, you can see there's a lot more of this variance being attributed to uncertainty in traits, especially in the dry meadow. So we saw some kind of interesting variation between communities and also some temporal variation where forcing uncertainty became more important as you approach 2100, which makes sense as you're seeing larger differences in warming and things like that. But yeah, I thought it was interesting that the dry meadow had such a large proportion of its uncertainty due to traits, but you can kind of see in this plot why that is. And it seems like in general, with warming, we do see an increase in productivity in the moist and wet meadow, likely with increases in water use efficiency and photosynthetic rates, but we don't see that in the dry meadow where plants are likely already experiencing more water stress. So they just were more water limited potentially and did not become more productive with more warming. So that's why you see more of this uncertainty being attributed to traits in the dry meadow. So kind of main takeaways from this project, we found that incorporating variability in traits, especially related to foliar traits, phenology, can really help constrain carbon fluxes and improve our representation of alpine tundra. And generally, the uncertainty in functional trait change had a larger role in shaping productivity outcomes under climate change than differences in climate forcing scenario. But this does vary both spatially and over time. And one thing to point out is we may be underestimating trait uncertainty. It's because there are a lot of other traits that might change as communities are shifting with climate change. And we only looked at 3. So there could potentially be larger uncertainties. And we also weren't able to incorporate potential changes in phenology triggers or other things that link with warming. And thinking about next steps for this work, as I mentioned before, there's this exciting new ecosystem demography model called FATES that can be paired with CLM. And being able to calibrate that for this alpine tundra community could allow us to have traits changing over time in these climate change experiments instead of just kind of fixing a trait change and seeing what happens like we did. And plates basically can allow you to incorporate demographic change in vegetation over time and allow plants with different traits to compete for light and nutrients, and therefore allow the prediction of PFT distributions from plant traits. I think this will be a really useful next step for this work and kind of tying in with my easel work that I'm going to talk about in just a moment. So as I mentioned, I'm currently being funded by easel and NEON, and I think there's some really good kind of synergies between the work that I'm doing for each one. And I'm just going to talk briefly about that. So overall, for my easel work, kind of my main goal is to integrate remote sensing data sets, field observations, and modeling tools to quantify vegetation change and examine changes in some functions under climate change scenarios. And I think that, as I mentioned, calibrating plates kind of builds on the work that I've been doing, and this is something that's going to be really useful for both my easel work and my NEON work. I'll talk about why in a moment. So for my easel postdoc, I'm really interested in exploring woodland encroachment in alpine tundra. And this is kind of a global phenomenon that's occurring in grasslands worldwide, but especially in Arctic and alpine tundra communities. So you've probably heard about greening of the Arctic. In recent decades, there's been really large increases in shrub abundance in a lot of tundra regions generally, and especially in response to warming and other global change factors. And this has been studied a lot in the Arctic tundra, but not as much in the alpine. But this figure here is showing you a study from Niwot Ridge from 10 years ago, where they used some aerial imagery that goes all the way back to the 1940s to map shrub cover in that saddle site that I showed you earlier, and basically showed that, at least in that site, shrub cover was increasing exponentially over the 60-year study period. And then kind of some preliminary work that I did recently, you can see here, we're just showing that rates of increase in shrub cover tend to be spatially heterogeneous throughout the site. And we kind of observe that in the field too, like some areas where shrubs will come in and increase really quickly, and other areas will there come in and won't necessarily grow quickly. And we're kind of interested in exploring that variability and trying to figure out why there's so much variability in rates of encroachment. So the overall aim of my easel postdoc research is to quantify heterogeneous rates of expansion, starting at Niwot Ridge, because we have so much data there. It's kind of a really great training site, and then being able to scale up to the broader Rocky Mountain region. And I've been working closely with Sibeli on this, which has been really exciting, kind of developing some remote sensing techniques to incorporate into my work. So right now I'm working on mapping shrub cover at Niwot Ridge using NEON imagery from the NEON Airborne Observing Platform. So really high resolution imagery. And this will allow us to create a kind of really high resolution training data set where we can map shrub and herbaceous cover and then use spectral mixture analysis to quantify changes in shrub cover over time. And I'm also interested in mapping vegetation traits from hyperspectral data, which can allow us to kind of map the spatial variability in traits and incorporate that into modeling efforts. So in addition to the remote sensing piece of this work, the other main piece of it is to calibrate CLM with weights for this alpine tundra vegetation, which will allow us to project rates of shrub expansion under climate change and kind of compare that with what we find in our remote sensing analyses. And as I mentioned, I'm also being funded partially through NEON, so I just kind of wanted to touch on what I'm doing there as well. So just to give you an overview, so I'm being funded on this NCAR NEON collaboration project, which is linking NCAR's modeling tools with NEON's measurement network. Kind of the motivation being that limitations in data usability and competing infrastructure can prevent the integration of observations with modeling tools and kind of broader use in non-modeling communities. So this group of NCAR and NEON scientists, along with some university partners, created this computational platform that pairs NEON observations with CLM. And basically they created a really easy user interface where people can run CLM at a NEON site of their choice. And there's a bunch of tutorials and workflows that you can use to get a single point simulation up and running using NEON input data as model inputs, and then also making it really easy to compare kind of model outputs with NEON observations. So this is a really cool tool that kind of facilitates broader use of these observations and models with the aim of accelerating interdisciplinary efforts across ecology and climate sciences. So more recently, this project is funding me, and kind of my role is to develop workflows and tutorials for site level CLM fates calibration at neon tower sites. And right now I'm focusing just on alpine and Arctic sites. So I'm starting with Niwot Ridge, but I'm also interested in calibrating fates at Tulik Lake, which is an Arctic neon site. And kind of the overall hope is that these workflows can be adapted more broadly to be used at lots of different neon sites by the broader community. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? It was cool, those simulations that showed like pushing forward, the front pushing earlier in the spring in all three fields. But there was still like it shut down really hard in the fall. I'm sorry, yeah, that one.
This one.
Yeah, it's really cool that it pushes like forward in the spring, but everything's shutting down really hard in the fall.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we're actually kind of telling the model when to shut down
Okay.
phenology in the fall. So it's based on a day length criterion, and it's the same in all three communities. But that is something that we've talked about wanting to explore more, like when if the communities are nesting at different times and how to better incorporate that into the model. But right now they're just all shutting down once it reaches, I think, a 13-hour day length.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
There's 2 questions online, so if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Hi. So this is Yan Zhao. I'm from Terra Biological Station. So I have a question that I'm not very familiar
I'm gonna
with.
let him know his mic.
Okay, can you hear me? So so thank you for the great.
Not working.
Yeah.
I'm not applying.
Can you just read their question from the chat? They didn't put anything in the chat.
Hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Okay. So I'm not very familiar with the model, the community land model or the model you used, but I have a question like when you predict the future conditions.
Type it in the chat and then you could read
I
it.
think so. Yeah,
Robert, do you want to ask your question first while we wait? It might just be us because they can hear him on and you're not fine.
Oh, you can just pop up the room.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. No, so I have yeah, I love it that you try to better parameterize your models with site-specific phenology. And that's amazing, actually, the results that we got, like reducing the bias. However, I'm thinking here, if your intention by the end is to expand that through other tundra ecosystems beyond Niwot Ridge, are you thinking about like collecting data from other sites and incorporating for a better representation and parameterization of your model?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are trait databases, like there's specifically a tundra one. So that could provide maybe you could kind of average across different sites to get a more generalized value, but there isn't a lot of trait information from alpine sites generally. And as I've shown, it does tend to vary a lot, even over small distances spatially. So I think that is a challenge to kind of trying to get specific results, but then make it more broadly.
Yeah, so do you think like for now, like when you work in a specific site, you should work with like field-based data set, and field-based, I mean site-specific data set, and then when you expand that for other areas, you could go for a more general data sets. Let's try and so
Yeah, I think so, but yeah, I mean, I think any kind of alpine specific data will still be better than what the default is.
okay.
Yeah. But yeah, that's a really good point.
Can you show me the soil moisture graph? Okay.
Observations or
Scenario.
this is soil moisture under, is this what you're talking about?
Oh, yeah.
Or which,
So the changes in scenario with your future climate.
oh, here,
Yeah. This one. So I think that your results show that soil moisture will be decreased and GPP will be increased with future scenario, and it may indicate that there are increased fuels or other disturbance factors in the future with the encroachment in tundra alpine areas. And then in your research plan, you also mentioned that the dynamics between the alpine tundra and future climate change. So I'm wondering if there are any tools for the modeling the climate disturbances such as the wildfires or the droughts, and how can your results can link with the future climate disturbances?
yeah, that's a great question. You can include the effects of disturbances in CLM like fire, and especially with fates, that vegetation demographic model I mentioned, you can use that to kind of in a more complex way look at responses of vegetation to disturbance, how different PFTs will recover from disturbance or fire or things like that. Yeah.
The questions online are ready. I don't know if you can see them on, but the first one is from Robert. Do these models incorporate trait plasticity? A species assembled and measured in a particular environment might have very different trait expressions when the environment changes.
Yeah, that's a great question, Robert. And that's actually something I didn't talk about it here, but that's something I'm talking about trying to incorporate in my EASL postdoc project. Trying to look at kind of trait environment relationships and how to better incorporate them into models. Because generally, no, these models don't incorporate trait plasticity in response to the environment, but there have been some studies that have sort of worked to include trait environment relationships explicitly, and saw some pretty different outcomes in their results. So that's something that I'm hoping to kind of incorporate better into my future work.
You have a thumbs up emoji. And then the other one online is, does the model consider the change of plant composition for the future responses? We know that the plant distributions may change due to the climate change. Change of the plant distribution may change the local plant composition. and affect the ecosystem such as GPP, ER, and NE?
Yeah, so currently we're not incorporating changes in composition distributions. We're telling the model like this is where this PFD will grow, this is where this one will grow. But as I mentioned, by incorporating that kind of fates vegetation demographic piece, we can better incorporate these functional responses to the vegetation, and they can actually grow, or their distributions will change based on fate distributions and in response to environment within fates. So that's a way that we can incorporate that.
There's one more online. And then I observed that the late growing season may have low GPP due to the phenology of the plant. Do you think the GPP in late summer may be lower?
Referring to. That's something that I showed in one of my plots. But yeah, I think, I mean, at least being out in the field, that's something I've noticed is some of these plants turn brown and dry out in like early August, late July even. So yeah, I definitely think that it is lower in late summer.
Thank you, Katya. That was fantastic.